My absolute pleasure to introduce to you today our Day 1 keynote speaker for the SCDRP 9th annual meeting, Dr. Amanda Martin. So Dr. Amanda Martin has served as the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of North Carolina since 2021. Dr. Martin is a nationally recognized expert in climate resilience, disaster recovery, and community development. Her work has focused on building resilience in ways that advance economic prosperity, strengthen housing options, and celebrate cultural and natural heritage. Dr. Martin works to advance the state's resiliency efforts through policy advising, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. Dr. Martin holds a doctorate in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where her dissertation examined post-disaster home buyouts in North Carolina from the perspectives of resilience, recovery, and racial justice. She also holds a master's degree in city planning from MIT and a bachelor's degree from Harvard University. Dr. Martin has a rich and deep understanding and appreciation of what we aim to do here at SCDRP, as Dr. Martin served as the director of SCDRP for 2+ years, and she served on our advisory board for many years. So Dr. Martin, we are honored and humbled to welcome you back home to SCDRP as our Day 1 keynote kickoff speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Amanda Martin.
All right, good morning, everyone. So, let's see. As Heather said, my name is Amanda Martin, and I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of North Carolina. And unlike Mr. Harris, I have a staff of 7, which is amazing. We've grown it slowly over the years. And I want to recognize Brian Byfield, who I work with. Brian, raise your hand. And I'm so happy to be here because, as Heather said, I used to work with the Southeastern Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership from about 2016 to 2019. And then I served on the board after that, after I started working with the state. And then they issued me some kind of cooling off period before they wanted to hear from me again, hear my big ideas. So I'm thrilled to be here today to talk with all of you, an audience of who I consider colleagues and peers. I see many faces of people that I recognize, an important mentor, which is really exciting, and also many people that I have not yet met, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I have 3 little kids, so it's very hard for me to come to conferences, so I really like to take advantage and meet people when I do get the chance to be at a conference. And I'll just use the platform of the keynote for one moment. I have some anxiety as well because I'm one of those people that doesn't recognize faces well. And so please feel free to come up and say, hey, I'm Brian Byfield. We met at a conference a few years ago, because it makes it easier for me. So thank you. I do want to talk a little bit more about what's going on in North Carolina. Can y'all hear me? Okay. In particular about Hurricane Helene. Helene reached North Carolina on September 27th, 2024, which is the kind of thing like that date is going to be forever etched in the minds of people who live and work there. It brought historic rain, flooding, and tornadoes to the state. And the major impacts to the state were in a part of our state that's not accustomed to this kind of weather, these kinds of impacts. So the mountainous area of our state, the so-called 1,000-year event, caused widespread riverine flooding and landslides. And the conditions, I don't know if we have Helene survivors in our audience today, but the conditions were absolutely horrifying. If you hear stories about what people did to get out of the way, driving up mountains to try to get out of the way of floodwater, with roads liquefying underneath their cars through landslide action, like truly, really profound experiences that people have had. Entire homes were swept off their foundation and into rivers. and over 100 people in North Carolina lost their lives, which is the deadliest hurricane in the United States since Maria in 2017. The impacts are estimated to include damage or loss to 73,000 homes, large-scale washout of roads and bridges, including I-40, which remains closed between North Carolina and Tennessee, and also uncountable an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 private roads and bridges, which is a big problem in our particular, especially to the mountainous part of our state. There was a loss of water and sewer infrastructure in many, many cities and towns, some of which have been paying to so-called pump and dump sewage, which is extremely expensive, a major burden on small local governments, and massive business closures as well. This is an area that's very dependent on tourism, and a lot of businesses are wondering right now if they're going to make it. And so I will say in most parts of Western North Carolina, at least, they do want y'all to come and visit and support the communities that are able to, or support the businesses that are able to be open. So I want to make sure that y'all receive that invitation as well. The velocity of the water, let me talk about a few aspects of Helene that distinguish it from the storms and the flooding we're more used to having in the eastern part of the state. And one of those things is just the pure velocity of the water. It was so much so that it actually changed the topography of many communities. The course of rivers and streams was changed. So in some places you might have a stream that's moved 50 feet to the west of where it was before. And now communities are faced with abutting property owners who are wondering, well, that land that used to be a stream, it's now dry. Can I build there? And let me tell you, our floodplain ordinances were not designed to answer this kind of a question. So once again, we have been schooled by the dynamic nature of our natural systems and how our assumptions that we live in a world with a predictable, static system failed us. Another element of this topographic change is that the river channels and stream channels, many of them were actually flattened out by the velocity of the water. And so in places where your channel used to be more of a V, it has a broad base now. And so in those places where we've had streams and rivers change course, we don't actually know what size of storm or what amount of water it would take for it to switch back again. And we assume it would be less than a Hurricane Helene because of that change in the contours of the land. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing with Helene that are different from some of the challenges that we've faced in the past. I did want to share, as Mr. Harris said, Helene was not the only federal disaster declaration in North Carolina this year. A few weeks before Helene, we had this system that dumped 18 inches of rain in this area. That's the potential tropical cyclone 8. We call her PTC 8. It washed out roads, bridges, caused home damage, and some communities still have only 1 or 2 roads in or out of their community. So a major impact in this part of the state that I'm sure some of the local folks here would be happy to share more about what they experienced with that. Coming back to the SCDRP, because I worked with the partnership, I do want to share that this idea that we would come together to talk about these things, talk about new and emerging issues in resilience like what we're facing with the Helene recovery. While the SCDRP is 9 years old, next year will be 10, the idea that we would come together across a larger geography to discuss that is even older than that. We had coordination with the Governor's South Atlantic Alliance before this organization, and even before that through SURPASS, which is a public-private partnership that works on land stewardship around military bases. So this is an enduring idea that we need regional collaboration on resilience issues. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is why that idea is so compelling and why we continue to come together to do this work, what the need is for. And when I thought about preparing these remarks and why we're all here together, I was struck by 3 kind of fundamental truths that we are all working with. The first one is that all communities everywhere are unique and have inherent value. So all communities are unique and have inherent value. No matter how poor or how ritzy, how backwater, or how fancy and touristy, how hazard prone, every community has a story to tell, stories to tell. And those are stories worth telling, and they're stories worth hearing. And if we are practitioners, especially if we are doing work in communities that are not our own, this is the very oxygen that we breathe, is that belief. That is the deep respect that we come into a community with. The second fundamental truth is that all communities change. All communities must change. Not changing is just never totally an option. Change might not come consistently. The kind of change that we talk about, climate change, comes from environmental hazards from systems outside of a community largely. And there are other kinds of change too. There's policy change, political change, cultural change, economic change. There's change that comes from outside communities. There's change that comes from within communities. So change, and just the idea that we could just not change and just stay who we are is just not, it's not real. It's not an option. So we have this reality that communities are faced with change. And so the kind of third truth that I came to, and in my opinion, this is kind of like the founding principle of the resilience work we do, is that communities flourish when they have the chance to anticipate and respond to drivers of change in ways that honor the wellness of the community and its parts. And so that's kind of like a long sentence. I should have put it into ChatGPT or something. So I do want to break it apart a little bit. Communities flourish when they anticipate and respond to drivers of change in ways that honor the wellness of the community and its parts. The communities flourish part, and I was so excited to hear the cultivate metaphor as well. I'm really into this word flourish. In the essay, The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer, I don't know if any of y'all have read it. It came out recently in book format. It's really beautiful. And she writes that all flourishing is mutual. And she's a scientist, and she looks towards the natural world to show that systems of ecology are actually totally bound up in mutualism and reciprocity. And then she compares that to the humanity of economic and social systems that are also built on values of abundance and reciprocity. And she's largely writing about indigenous communities in the United States. Of course, colonialism not known for reciprocity. But she has these really beautiful analogies of how we are brought to flourish when we manage to have systems that embrace and lift up abundance and reciprocity. And this really reminded me of the kinds of change that we are both experiencing in communities and often trying to cultivate as well, this idea that we flourish. It's not always as intentional or as specific as our vision. A wildflower might pop up in a place where the conditions are right, and we can't always predict what that exactly is going to be, but we want positive change, and that's what I mean by communities flourishing. Next, communities flourish when they anticipate and respond to drivers of change. I think this is the part that we do really well, or at least we think we do it really well. Our climatologists, our hydrologists, our science communicators, our geographers have dug in very deep in the last 10 to 15 years and given us a tremendous amount of data and information about the changes, the environmental and climatic hazards that we are facing. What we do with that information, I'm going to talk a little more about that later on. But how communities anticipate and respond to this information and to drivers of change really matters, which leads me to the final component, is that communities flourish when they anticipate and respond to drivers of change in ways that honor the wellness of the community and its parts. And this is what we're going for, right? For communities to do well. And we need to leave that phrase open-ended, because it's not always about adapting to climate change in ways that cost the least amount of money, or even ways that cause the least amount of stress. It's about an overall holistic wellness of a community. And honestly, we can't guarantee wellness. We cannot guarantee that. We all know that communities are facing extraordinary drivers of change, often in combination with one another. Often it's climate plus economic, climate plus another kind of driver. And so the question is then, how do we retain our stories even when we have to change? And that's a part of wellness, and that's an important question. So if this is our mission, to help communities flourish in this way, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we have a lot of work left to do. Our communities are very vulnerable in many different, each in their unique ways. And they're also very strong, each in their unique ways. The systems that protect our communities are often underinvested and underappreciated, and that is also part of our work going forward. As I was writing this, I was, of course, imagining communities in the sense of a group of people who share something in common and usually live in a particular place. But I'd like to also imagine that us here in this hall, we are a community too. We are a community of climate practitioners. And our community also inevitably will change. And we're facing some very profound external pressure, like policy context changing, funding context changing, data changing, data disappearing. And what I want to say to you all is that we are literally professionals in this. We are professionals in being resilient to bad, hard stuff. And our community, too, will flourish as we anticipate and respond to these external drivers of change. And we will do that in ways that honor our community and what we have to offer. It's shared goals and values to build resilience in our community. So let us not forget any of that as we enter this newly uncertain year, 2025. We understand what it means to build redundancy in data systems, or some of us do at least. We understand our need to reduce our vulnerability and our sensitivity to fluctuating federal systems or federal governments. And we share and value our grief when we recognize what has been lost. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about a few areas of growth for our field as we face our next era of practice together. And as I share these ideas, I want to credit my entire professional network in having these conversations. Not one of these ideas is mine alone. These are all things that have come out in conversations with my fantastic resilience staff, with the state, and also with folks like you, also out in communities learning about their experience. So I think there's two thematic areas in which our field can grow. One category is learning, and the other category is imagining. So first, let's talk about learning. I think we're all very sensitive and acutely aware this week that after a major transportation tragedy, we have a National Transportation Safety Board that examines all aspects of what happened, looks for evidence about where things could have gone differently, and issues recommendations. I don't think it's such a wild idea that we might do something similar for our natural disasters. We might closely examine places that have been through something like a Helene to understand what happened, what went poorly, and what went well. And I think if we did that, we would understand our climate hazards less as an act of God under which we can't really control what happens, and more as there's an element of act of God, of course, but the impacts of our disasters are a result of tens and hundreds of years of decisions and limitations that we've had all along the way. And I think that we might start to understand more our role as humans with agency in how we rebuild and how we prepare ourselves for a future of more storms like that. Side note, it kind of kills me. I do have to say this, Helene was unprecedented, and it was the storm of a generation. And I don't think anyone in their lifetime, insert joke here about older folks, but had experienced anything like this in Western North Carolina, and that's an important part of their experience. But when we say it's once in a lifetime, or when we say it's the 1,000-year event, it does really imply that we won't have to go through this again. And I hope and pray that those communities will never see that kind of impact again, that kind of water again, but somewhere will. We know that somewhere will. So learning, coming back to learning. I think we also need to build a culture of learning within our resilience practice. I'll never forget when I was interviewing someone for a job that I later hired them. But interviewing isn't super fun even for the interviewer. And I got through my questions, and then I sort of sit back and say, okay, what questions do you have for us? And she said, well, I'm wondering what your plan is for monitoring and evaluation. And I was like, what? I was ready to answer the, work-life culture. Like, there were so many questions I was going to win at. And this was not one of them. I had to look her in the eye and say, we don't have one, and we need one. Thank you for asking that question. And our programs are coming along. We are starting to do more program evaluation, but we're not in a field that demands it as rigorously as some other fields like public health or international development. And so we need to, continue to make strides in this area. And while we're doing that, I think we need to make sure we're also asking the big question of, are we taking the actions that actually matter? Like, what is our end goal here? If our end goal of our program is to be a plan, and that is the end goal of a lot of the work that we do, is for communities and regions to have a plan, are those plans resulting in action, and why or why not? And that's for, I heard there's a third of people who are academics in this room, which is awesome. There's a ton of research, a great body of research on plan quality and what makes a plan good. There's not a lot of research on whether plans drive outcomes in the community. And we really need that research. Like, what are the conditions under which plans result in action? So I want to encourage all of us to be asking also these more open-ended questions about what is the end goal here. If it's a project, does the project perform the way, if it's a construction project, an infrastructure project, or even like a conservation project, does it perform the way that we think it will? And I know not all of these questions have a quantitative answer. I'd also really encourage all of us to not get sucked into everything has to have a number. Like, numbers are really important, but not every question can be answered by a number. And those are still questions that we have to ask. All right, so we talked about an after-action review. We talked about a culture of learning. We talked about program outcomes, not just program outputs. Another learning item is, how do we learn from what worked? How do we learn from the storm that had an impact and the levee that held, or the community that came together afterwards? If we don't recognize the contribution of these more positive elements in our communities, it's harder to support them. So, for example, in the case of the levee that held, if we're not very conscious about it, it could be possible, instead of using it as a case to maintain the levee, we might sort of divert our attention to things that are more obviously problems. So maybe the system that worked is the hardworking, tiny local government staff, or the cog that augments it. And rather than take that for granted, we want to make sure that all the stakeholders in the room understand and respect the positive contribution of local staff towards resilience. Maybe it's a community youth group, or even the AA group, that keeps one another informed and supported during a very hard time. So let's make sure that we are really learning about these sources of resilience so that we can listen to them, learn with them, learn from them, and lift up what works. So the second thematic area is about imagining. I'll be honest, this is where my notes end. But it's because I think about this all the time, is that I think that we our field is really good at analysis, and we need to flex more in the imagination space. So I've been a part of many planning exercises where we had a tremendous, thorough, multi-hazard vulnerability assessment. And then when we go to the plan, we basically ignore the assessment and ask for strategies from other places, from like community engagement, from previous plans, all good sources of projects. But there's this complete disconnect. Okay, so guilty. And we need to figure out how to have plans and have projects and have strategies that are more responsive to the analysis and the data that we are using. And we need to turn on our creativity and our imagination in how to do that. And in some arenas, there can be kind of like then the logical next step is like, okay, let's make it into a math problem. We'll like assign points to these different strategies and we'll add them all up, and the strategy that has the most points or the vulnerability that has the most points comes out on top. And again, that is a totally legitimate method, but I think we need to expand how we are thinking about this problem. We need to go to and with a community, with data analysis, to hear from them what parts of this are most meaningful to you. Does this match up with the impact that you're seeing on the ground? Is there something missing here? Okay, given this information, given what we've learned from both the science and the local knowledge, which of these are most important to address first? And those are not simple questions. It can't be calculated on an Excel spreadsheet. But it really needs to happen in order for us to actually make the most of the data that we do have. And then kind of separately is moving from those findings into project ideas. And again, this is where I think we have a kind of a science down for the vulnerability assessment. But when we move from here are the problems to here's how we solve them, it's not a science. It's more of an art. It's a, what scale do we want to try to solve this at? What kinds of fields of practice are we going to pull in? Which stakeholders are most interested? And so this is this kind of gap in the theory of our practice, literally, from moving from assessment into action. And I was thinking of the example of a hackathon. So I've never done a hackathon before, but it sounds very cool. My understanding is the idea that everybody kind of gets a problem, and then you split into teams, and it's like a software engineering type problem. And your team works together to develop a creative solution to it, and then everybody comes back together and presents their ideas, and maybe there's a winner. So couldn't we do something like this to start to really grow this idea that creativity and imagination and innovation are part of our practice? Could we do a competition? If there's any philanthropies in the room, let me know. Could we do a competition where we set out with professionals and we give them a vulnerability assessment and then say, go back with your biologist and your engineer and your software engineer and your community organizer and tell us what actions you think you would recommend. And then you get back and see what all these different teams came up with. I think too often we start with the idea for the solution in mind, and that closes off opportunities. A final example in the imagine category is that we must learn more from other places, from what other places are doing. And frankly, that starts even with Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. I thought, does anyone want to raise their hand if you're here from PR or USVI? Thank you guys for joining us. I think that we don't even on stateside learn enough from what's working in our island communities, not to even mention another nation entirely. And I think this is a failure of our imagination. It's easy to say, like, that's a different policy context, different economic situation, different culture, and those things are all true. But guess what? Our policy context is like shifting beneath our feet right now. And so, it behooves us to use our power of imagination to say, this could work. It would look like this here. It would be different. Or we can try that concept and see how it works out. So the power of imagination. So I've put forward some specific ideas, I hope, about why we do our work and how I think we can grow our practice to achieve our shared goal together. I want to end with a few thoughts about how we build up our practice, especially towards regional collaboration. I think we all recognize that as we sit here in early February 2025, we're not sure if these are really conditions for flourishing. It feels like some kind of like a clear cut that might be happening. We're not sure. But I think that some surprising things might grow if we really dig in and think about how we build resilience as a community of practice. We are not giving up on robust federal fundings for our programs at all. And it will be the job of many people in this room to continue to advocate for those funding sources. But we are looking at other ways to fund our work. We're also looking at ways to deliver our work at lower costs, maybe using innovative formats. Maybe that ranges from flexing opportunities with AI to using peer coaching and peer learning in communities that have similar challenges. We also need to think about resilient strategies within communities that are lower cost. Big infrastructure projects absolutely are needed, but let's go back to that idea that we might also learn what's working, and those things might not be high ticket. Let's ensure that our resilient strategies include capacity, communication, and outreach. These are interventions that cost less but are just packed with resilience. We will also need to engage stakeholders that are not always the easiest to get the attention of. Our local officials are some of the most passionate and knowledgeable about local resilience and local challenges, and they have an important voice in budgeting, local budgeting, and also with our state legislatures. We also need to work with our state elected officials. Do we have any elected officials in the room? Sometimes we get folks who are on their local boards, which is awesome. Tomorrow, great. Our state legislature has actually been very receptive to the idea of funding flood mitigation. And they're also very interested in what neighboring states are doing. So I think that's an in for our regional approach. I'll say their interest usually is in the name of slamming state employees in North Carolina as being inadequate, but take the invitation where we get it, and we want to invite regional concepts. And we have some nascent partnerships with organizations in South Carolina, for example, where we're trying to learn from one another and coordinate and see, just starting across borders. You know, we share a lot of the flooding problems in South Carolina come from North Carolina. And so I'm looking at my South Carolina partner. And so, you know, can we be partnering together on some lower hanging fruit, like making sure we're sharing data and identifying potential projects? Our grassroots communities have done incredible resilience work, often not just without government support, but sometimes in spite of historic harmful policies and programs. And these communities absolutely understand that resilience is not just a high-cost infrastructure investment. It's a system of support, love, direct aid, and political organizing. Our grassroots organizations have incredible knowledge, and our relationships with them must be sustained and committed and transparent, building trust for the very long term where some trust has been broken. Our business community, I won't say enough here, but is a critical point of engagement. Businesses are not just, they are economic engines, not just economic engines. They keep communities functioning. They are part of that inherent value of every community. Business owners and workers have a strong stake in resilience. So conversations with these stakeholders, businesses, elected officials, grassroots organizers, they will look different from conversations that we might have more regularly. Each will start in a different place and will probably use different vocabulary. Some may not be friendly conversations at first, and our job is to listen and learn at first, to ask open-ended questions. What's on your mind when it comes to your community's resilience? With this information, we can start to understand the issues and the interests that these groups hold and how they overlap with the core issues and interests of our practice. Together, we can explore potential action steps that advance their interests along with ours. So let us be creative in coming up with action steps that have value for multiple groups of stakeholders and multiple kinds of interests. Let us imagine with these partners, not for them, but with them. So none of this work that we face is easy, and I think we know that, but again, let us not just choose an easy path. Let us choose the resilience-building way, forging relationships and committing to long-term contributions. Let us learn, let us imagine, and let us go together into this work. Thank you.